Welcome, everyone. We're delighted to host Donald Robertson on the podcast today. He's an expert on Stoicism, which is an ancient philosophy practiced by leaders like Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus. A lot of people confuse Stoicism with the adjective Stoic, that it's a different thing, and we'll get into that. Something piqued my interest in this philosophy. I think I stumbled upon it on Reddit. There's a subreddit all dedicated to Stoicism. And I ended up reading a few books on it. One of them was Donald's How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. It's terrific. I highly recommend it. I really loved it. There's so much good advice in there for type Cs. And it gave me some new perspectives on how to better manage emotions and how to think about living a more fulfilling life. So we reached out to Donald, and he was gracious enough to come on and talk to us today about his work. He's written several books, actually, and I think he said 9. And he's also a psychotherapist and a trainer. So thank you, Donald. We're so glad you're here. And maybe a great starting place is to describe some of the basic principles of Stoicism. We're guessing most of our listeners haven't really heard of it, don't know much about it.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm quite excited and looking forward to this because the Type C concept, I think, is a very intriguing concept, and it's an interesting comparison. So I'll give you a very brief introduction to Stoicism for your listeners. First of all, we should probably say a little bit about the history of it and who it is. The guys are that we're talking about. It's mainly a bunch of male philosophers, although there's some the Stoics were one of the schools of philosophy actually that thought that women should learn philosophy as well. They weren't exactly proto-feminists, but they were more embracing of female philosophers than some of the other schools. It was founded in 300 BC by a guy called Zeno of Citium, who is a merchant who arrived at Athens. It was heavily influenced by earlier philosophies, particularly the teachings of Socrates, and it lasted for nearly 500 years as a living tradition of philosophy in the ancient world. And so some of the famous figures that people might come across are, you mentioned Epictetus, Seneca. Marcus Aurelius was a big deal. He was actually a Roman emperor. But the emperor Augustus, the founder of the Roman Empire, had also read Stoicism. And one of our main sources for Stoicism is actually Cicero, who's one of the most famous orators in history, a really important author. He wasn't a Stoic, but he had studied Stoicism in detail and wrote a lot about it. So that's where we get our information from. What did the Stoics actually believe? Well, first and foremost, Stoicism was an ethic. So the Stoics had what scholars call a virtue ethic, and they believed that virtue or excellence of character or moral wisdom, depending how you want to frame it, a character trait, basically, was the most important thing in life. And that was the key to flourishing. So you could argue, because of this emphasis on our own character, there's intrinsically a kind of self-improvement slant to Stoicism and similar philosophies. They're all very much about improving our character, gaining wisdom and emotional resilience. The main corollary of that is that Stoics thought that the things that most people normally value, like wealth and reputation and stuff like that society kind of teaches us to value, are not as important as we're led to believe in life. So they may actually be of some instrumental value in life, but they're not the be all and end all. And it's wisdom and character flourishing is more important than how much money you've got in the bank or how many followers you've got on Facebook. Radical idea. But this is the core of the Stoics' philosophy. And the Stoics quickly realized that if you embrace this virtue ethic and shift in your values, this orientation, that it would lead to emotional resilience. And so the word Stoicism, of course, kind of became almost synonymous. To be Stoic is, in a sense, connected roughly with the idea of emotional resilience. Because if I thought learning how to be wiser, more just, more courageous, more self-disciplined was more important than how much money I've got in the bank or how famous I am, that would make me less upset than somebody who invested a lot of value in their reputation or their wealth if I lost those things or they were threatened or damaged in some way. So that shift in values, the Stoics thought, makes you more emotionally resilient, and more able to cope with adversity. And that was one of the reasons that people have been drawn to it throughout history. But as you're aware, it leads to misconceptions about Stoicism. So people today, many branches of Greek philosophy. So if somebody says someone is Epicurean, um, that doesn't mean the same thing as being a follower of the ancient Epicurean philosophy. It means that they like fine dining and stuff like that. If someone says that they're cynical, doesn't mean that they're a follower of ancient Cynic philosophy. Skeptic, academic, sophist, all of these words have kind of degraded their meaning over the centuries, right? But we still use them in modern English. They're all derived from branches of Greek philosophy. And Stoicism today is used to mean having a stiff upper lip or being unemotional, or you could, in slightly more technical terms, suppressing or concealing unpleasant or embarrassing emotions. It's an emotional coping style. And in a sense, it's the crudest and most simplistic emotional coping style. And there's a body of research converging from different researchers around the world that suggests that that type of stoicism, having a stiff upper lip approach, isn't particularly healthy for us, especially in the long run. It's not a very good way of coping emotionally, generally speaking. And so to distinguish that from Stoic philosophy, we usually write it with a lowercase s, and Stoic philosophy has a capital S. And in Stoic philosophy, I'm sure we'll come to this, but just to give the listeners a heads up, one of the main reasons that people are interested in it today is that it's the main philosophical inspiration for cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the leading evidence-based form of modern psychotherapy, basically. And so you wouldn't want to confuse something that research suggests is an unhealthy way of coping and not very good for your mental health with something that inspired one of the leading evidence-based modern therapies, which is known to be good for your mental health. And yet, all over the internet, people confuse these two things, which is kind of unfortunate. So we want to try and separate them out and be clear about what the ancient Stoics were actually saying. And as you say, how it might be particularly relevant to people with a type C personality.
Well, I think that was a very helpful explanation, and I I'm already have a lot of questions. But the first question I want to ask you about is for
Yeah.
people that have type C traits,
Yeah.
suppression of emotion is the gold standard, and specifically anger. So for people who are type C, we don't let ourselves feel it. We put on a unfailingly pleasant facade. And in Stoicism, you say we should let ourselves feel anger and work to deconstruct it. And that all stems from a belief that we've been somehow harmed. I would love if you feel comfortable to dig into this idea a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, this is a can of worms, right? Because it's going to take us on a journey, and it starts with folk psychology, which is what people call the kind of default psychological assumptions that our culture makes. So we all have assumptions about what emotions are and how our minds work and things like that, that are kind of embedded in the language that we use. We just inherit from our culture. And the folk psychology of emotion is not very good. Like it's quite simple. Like so, the folk psychology of emotion, the way everyone normally talks about emotion, is it's like a kind of energy that wells up inside you. It's like a blob or something of like it's kind of homogenous in a way. I've got this anger in me, right? It's kind of welling up, and I can vent it at the gym, or I can kind of try and push it down. Maybe it's going to start leaking out my ears or something like that. We talk almost like it's a force or a substance. Sometimes it's called the hydraulic model of emotion, like it's like water pressure building up, like they were kind of damming or something like that. Um, and yet that psychological research on emotions suggests that that's not really a very good way of understanding how emotions in general function. For a start, emotions are made of multiple ingredients. It's like baking a cake or something. There's like a recipe list. So anger probably consists of certain action tendencies or desires, behaviors, certain physiological components. There's maybe certain styles of thinking, certain underlying attitudes and values that all go in the mix, like and get combined, and that bakes the cake of anger, if you like, right? And it maybe varies a little bit from one culture and historical era to another. So thinking of anger and other emotions as kind of composite potentially gives us a little bit more control over them. It gives us a slightly more nuanced understanding of them. Now, that's my kind of lead in to saying the Stoics had a more nuanced understanding of emotion. And actually, most of the confusion that arises, and maybe one of the reasons that people have this caricature of lowercase Stoicism. So, lowercase Stoicism uses the folk psychology concept. Like, lowercase Stoicism is like, oh, I've got this anger, I should kind of try and suppress it or conceal it or something, rather than trying to understand it, perhaps. You know, dissect it, analyze it a little bit, work with it in different levels. So the Stoics thought, first and foremost, the reason that they inspired cognitive therapy is they had a cognitive theory of emotion way ahead of the curve. Like, cognitive therapy really originated pretty much in 1950s, 1960s, didn't even become mainstream until about the 80s or the 90s, but the Stoics had a cognitive theory of emotion. They said emotions, like to a large extent, are characterized by certain underlying beliefs, and they even had a cognitive theory of psychopathology, as we call it. So they wrote books about how different emotions are characterized by different beliefs. So the Stoics said fear is the belief that something bad is about to happen imminently, right? So, and then anger is more like the desire to get payback against somebody for a perceived injury. They had quite a simple cognitive model, but actually it's not that dissimilar to the cognitive models of different emotions that you find today. So different emotions are characterized by different beliefs. The Stoics also believed that there were voluntary and involuntary components to emotion. Now they're playing three-dimensional chess now with emotion. Like they're like these guys are. This is 2,300 years ago, and these guys are like, no, 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 no. Emotions have got multiple components. Like, there's different beliefs underlying them. There's bits that we've got control over and bits that are more automatic. And that leads to a much more sophisticated understanding of how we would potentially cope with them. So what the Stoics would say is that there are involuntary thoughts, like automatic thoughts, we call them today, that pop into your mind. Once you've had an automatic thought, like maybe somebody bumps into you and you think, that guy's a jerk. Well, now it's too late to unthink it. Like you've already had the thought. So what you're going to do now, you might choose what you do next. You might choose how you respond to it, but you can't unthink the thought. And nevertheless, people try to kind of suppress or delete thoughts that they don't like or distract themselves from them as if they could somehow get rid of them rather than choosing a conscious response to them. So the Stoics think there's automatic thoughts and also automatic feelings that characterize the initial phase of an emotion, and that we have to accept those and we should view them as morally indifferent in their terms. Now that's important because it means that they don't think we should see them as harmful or bad, because that would get us into a struggle. That would get us into a fight that we can never win, in a sense, where we're battling against our own emotions and trying to unthink thoughts and unfeel feelings. We go, no, 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 I mustn't feel that, right? Well, that's that's a losing game, basically, and it tends to lead to quite a lot of problems. You tie yourself in knots trying to unthink thoughts and unfeel feelings. It's too late. You've already had them. You didn't choose to feel that feeling when someone bumped into you. You didn't choose to have that thought, but it's up to you to decide what you're going to do next, how you're going to respond to it. And so that's why the Stoics then place quite a lot of emphasis on how we respond to the initial automatic feeling. And also how the main way they respond by shifting perspective, changing the behavior in certain ways, doing things that you can voluntarily do. But there's quite a lot of emphasis in Stoicism because it's a philosophy on using reason. So looking at what our beliefs are, whether we choose, in their language, they even use a technical term that's become a term of art in modern psychology. So the Stoics say we have these initial impressions, and it's up to us whether we give assent to them, as they say. So I might think, this guy's a jerk. And then I can decide, is that just an automatic reaction, or do I really, do I want to agree with that belief and buy into it and go along with it? Or do I want to take a step back from it and think that was just a reflex causing that thought to pop into my mind? I don't necessarily have to agree with that initial thought. We call that cognitive distancing now. which is seeing thoughts as events that happen in our mind rather than confusing them with reality. So rather than thinking, but that guy actually, objectively speaking, really is a jerk, I think, no, it's just a label I'm attaching to him. Just a bunch of words that pop into my mind, and someone else might have labeled him differently or interpreted the situation differently. If I was in a different mood, maybe I would have thought about it differently. But that's just a sentence that flashes through my mind. So seeing the thought as something I'm projecting onto the situation and realizing that I can choose whether I continue to buy into it or not allowing it to hijack my thoughts is a nuanced idea. We call this cognitive diffusion or cognitive distancing today. We have to have a technical jargon for it because it's not a familiar concept to many people. The Stoics had the same concept. They were pretty familiar with this idea. So they think we need to accept our initial angry feelings, and that doesn't mean acting on them, behaving aggressively, for example. We can choose how we respond. And viewing them with indifference, or not viewing them as scary or bad or dangerous, just viewing them as a kind of natural reflex. And also accepting our initial thoughts that flash into our mind. That doesn't mean buying into them or agreeing with them. It just means observing them and thinking, oh, I thought to myself, what a jerk. Like, I guess, that was like a reflex, but now I'm going to choose whether I continue to go along with that thought, or maybe I, empathize with the other person, or maybe I try and view the situation from a different perspective. So that's basically unpacking a little bit how the Stoics thought about anger. They start from a different point. They have a different starting point from many self-improvement influencers on the internet today, and that they don't think of anger just as something that I'll give you an example, right? Many people would say, look, a lot of influencers today might say, when you're angry, what you should do is go to the gym and channel your anger into pumping things or whatever, like in the gym, right? Get it all out your system, and anger could be a good thing in that way. But from the Stoic perspective, and the perspective of cognitive therapy, that does pretty much nada to change the underlying beliefs and attitudes that made you prone to getting angry in the first place. It's kind of a bit of a band-aid solution. It'll get rid of the feeling, but it doesn't do anything to change the angry thoughts, beliefs, and attitudes that you had in the background.
Corey, I would just love to hear your perspective as a
Yeah.
cognitive
Oh, I have
behavioral
so many
therapist.
thoughts. I have so many thoughts, but I'm just so happy to hear you say this because I specialize in cognitive behavior therapy, but one of the things in particular that I focus on is acceptance and commitment therapy. And there are
Yeah.
so many overlaps with Stoicism as you're talking about it. But I'm just
Yep.
so happy that you are highlighting a lot of things that I just think, people in our culture and in Western culture are very focused, as you said at the beginning, of success and status and money, and often wind up not being happy.
hmm
And you're talking about such important things. And we also live in a culture, and I regularly talk to patients when they call me and they say, I want to get rid of my anxiety, or I want to get rid of my depression. And as much as I would love to say, I am here to help you with that, I always like to tell people that life has moments where you're going to feel anxiety or depressed.
hmm
And it's really about how do you manage it more effectively. And I think what you're talking about, which is so helpful, is would you be willing to pull it apart, right? Look at the elements. So you're talking about how Stoicism and cognitive behavior therapy think about anger or sadness or fear as constructs that are made up, as you said, of, we like to call them from a CBT perspective, stories in our head, right? And that may have to do with our background, maybe early learned experiences or cultural influences, societal influences, all those things that we have attached, those thoughts, as you said, those automatic thoughts that show up. And
Yep.
often those are so fused so deeply with feelings we're not necessarily always aware of them. And then, as you
hmm
said, your responses, right? These thoughts, the behaviors, and the responses. So I'm so appreciative of all the things that you're highlighting, because I think ultimately, in order to get to a better place, understanding the depth of what a feeling is about, feeling angry, feeling fear, there's so much more to it. So
Yeah.
I would love you to share a little bit about, how do Stoics advise that we go about trying to let go of the things that we can't control. For people
Hmm.
who are type C, we are often trying to influence and feel like it's safer if we have control over other people around us. And obviously I have lots of ideas about this, but would just love to hear what a Stoic, from a Stoicism perspective, the guidance is how to help and manage letting go of the things we obviously can't control, but feel we need to and may not always realize that we can't.
Well, this may surprise you, but I'm going to give you an example where I'm pretty much just going to directly quote Epictetus, and you tell me if it sounds like ACT or acceptance and commitment therapy. So Epictetus tells his students, and what we have from Epictetus are transcripts of stuff he actually said to his students that one of his students wrote down. He says, when you experience a troubling impression, like a negative automatic thought, basically, he said you should speak to it, talk to the thought. It's a pretty weird, pretty wacky thing to do, right? Sometimes you've got to do slightly odd things in order to change the psychological processes, like the novel things. So you should speak to it. And this is what you should say. He tells them exactly what to say. He says, you are just an impression, and not the whole story about the thing that you claim to represent. I would describe that as verbal diffusion, you know, or cognitive distancing, or whatever you want to call it in jargon terms. So he says, talk to the thought. Say, in act, you might say, hello, thought. You're just a thought. You're the map and not the terrain. Right? You're just one way of representing things. That's the first thing he says you should do. You should talk to thought and say, you're just an impression and not entirely the thing that you claim to represent. And then he says you should decouple action from the emotion. So he says you should postpone responding until you've calmed down and you regained your composure, which is a pretty common technique in ancient philosophy because we hear about this a lot. You could call it postponement. So often people say when they get really angry, one of the things they'll do is wait until they've calmed down. They'll say, I don't need to respond right now. Can I wait until I regain my composure? And then I'm more able to respond assertively rather than aggressively, perhaps. I don't think that applies to every single situation, but it's pretty good advice. And then he says, you should ask yourself, is this thought about things that are up to me or things that are not up to me? And you should make a clear distinction. Because the opening passage of Epictetus's handbook says something very odd. It says some things are up to us and other things are not. And that's a pretty weird way to begin a manual for living in accord with philosophy because it's a platitude, right? It's a truism. You might say Epictetus, that's like saying some things are big and other things are small. I mean, that's like, some things are black and other things are white. It's a kind of banal thing to say. Of course, some things are up to us and other things are not. Everybody knows that already. But his point is, no, they don't. And I think everybody recognizes this. That of course, it's something odd about this. It should be straightforward and is the simplest thing in the world. And yet we constantly confuse what's up to us and what isn't. In fact, everything that we just said a moment ago could be viewed from that perspective. People, if you think there are aspects of anxiety or anger that are involuntary, and then there's a voluntary phase, people spend a lot of time trying to control the bits that aren't under their control and neglecting to take responsibility for the bits that are potentially under their control. So even in terms of the way that we process our emotions, this is blurred, and gets confused, and we do often the opposite of what we should be doing. So that's this distinction between what's up to us and what isn't is really something that, in my experience, it's one of the first things that people latch onto in Stoicism. Modern authors sometimes call it the dichotomy of control. Many people just find the very concept empowering. You could do it. I'll very quickly say, how do you do this in practice, right? You ask yourself, you pause, you hit pause and go, hang on a minute. What aspects of this situation are actually under my direct control? And what bits can I only indirectly influence? Well, if you can only indirectly influence some stuff, like I could ask someone to do a favor for me, I could be super persuasive, but I can't guarantee they're definitely going to do it. It's partly out of my control. And so that means if I'm being wise and rational about it, I should be prepared in advance for the possibility it's not always going to go according to plan. That would mean that I'd have to have a flexible and adaptive attitude towards these things that aren't entirely under my control, like as opposed to a rigid black and white attitude that they have to go the way that I expect them to go. So recognize the dichotomy of control leads to more cognitive flexibility and more behavioral flexibility. If there's one thing that I would say one of the things that lots of different research converges on in the field of psychotherapy, it's that flexibility tends to be better than rigidity, like in almost every conceivable way. Psychological problems are typically characterized by rigidity in our thinking and our ways of coping, and making increasing flexibility tends to have quite obvious benefits, but also some more nuanced benefits as well. So that's what basically the Stoics would say. But what I was going to say is you could draw two columns on your flip chart in or on a bit of paper or whatever, and you could say, okay, in this situation, in one column, what are the bits that are completely under my control? And in the other column, what are the bits that aren't completely under my control that I need to accept, or at least partly in the hands of fate? I might have a preference about how they turn out. I strongly prefer it when people are nice to me, but I accept that that's not entirely under my control. And it would be pretty weird of me to expect that to happen 100% of the time from every human being that I encounter throughout the whole of my life. Sometimes people are going to be downright rude to me, or sometimes they might kind of come across like they are. Maybe, that's just the way that it seems to me. But if I'm flexible and adaptive and resilient, I need to be prepared for that in advance and not demand the impossible. Demanding the impossible is, in my experience, not a good coping strategy for life in general. And so in a sense, the Stoics are saying we all tend to demand the impossible from life, and that makes us angry. Like, people must respect me. Well, that's not going to happen 100% of the time. When we have these rigid demands, not thinking, it's almost like we come within a hair's breadth of just having an algorithm that says people must respect me, otherwise I'm going to get angry. Like, it's almost as simple as that, right? Whereas the rational person, the wise person, thinks, I love it when people respect me, but I don't expect it to happen 100% of the time, even though that I wish that it would. Like, and I'm ready for it when sometimes it doesn't. Prepared in advance to cope flexibly and adaptively with these situations. So I could draw these two columns. I could ask myself, as a percentage, how much control. I could draw a pie chart of how much control I have over a situation. I can analyze it in different ways. But what goes in the column that contains the things that are directly under my control? That's what Epictetus says in the next sentence. And he says, basically, not a lot. Yeah, I hate to break it to you kids out there. The column that contains the things that you have direct control over is pretty small. And the pie chart, that bit of the pie chart's quite small. The bit that contains stuff that you don't have direct control over is everything that other people do, how things turn out, like pretty much everything in like the past, the future, most things. Like you've got this tiny little bit that you've got control over, this island like of control. What does it consist in? Your own actions, like your free will, like the stuff that you do, your voluntary thoughts and actions, basically. And the Stoics say, this leads to a kind of mindfulness practice that the Stoics call prosoche. Like we should be focusing more attention on our locus of control. Like, so we should be turning our attention a little bit more to the quality of our voluntary thoughts and actions. Oh, so what would happen if we try to do those things better and we take more responsibility for them? That would lead to a virtue ethic. So you'd start to think, maybe I should try and act more wisely or more courageously, or with more compassion, like in terms of, my voluntary thoughts and actions, and maybe that would require paying a bit more attention to what's going on in the present moment if I don't completely control the past and the future. The only bit where I have direct control happens to be in the present moment, which is the time period in life, in my experience, that people are least interested in. Like most people are far more interested in the past or in the future. Like we have a natural tendency to forget about the present moment, even though that's where everything's going on. That's where our actions take place. It's like we're constantly taking our hands off the steering wheel. We're too busy, we're rubbernecking, sticking our head out the window, taking our hands off the steering wheel. Like, whereas mindfulness and prosody and stoicism wants us to ground our attention back, like where our control is in the present moment.
There's so much good stuff in there for type C. I don't even know where to start. But I think the point that you made about rigidity is so valuable to us because we're stuck in this rigid mindset of I can't disappoint anyone. I can't let them down. I can't
Yeah,
offend anyone. And I wanted to just bring up this point that I really found helpful in the book around cognitive distortions and how we
hmm
tend to just magnify these things in our minds. And I think the example that you used in the book was someone that lost their job and they were like, oh my God, I lost my job and I'm never going to work again and everything's going to fall
hmm
apart. I'm never going to eat. Instead of just saying, I lost my job and now I'm going to look for another one. So with type C,
yeah,
there's definitely a lot of distortion happening. We believe that we're somehow going to be harmed if we let
yeah,
someone down. So we'd just love to
yeah.
dig in a little bit more here and talk about this.
Well, the Stoics have a radical position on this. I mean, I would say it's controversial, but it's plausible. They adopt a hard line that says that the only really harmful thing, ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, when you're lying in your deathbed in your final few moments, looking back on your life as a whole, the Stoics say the only ultimately harmful thing are your own actions and behavior and your own character. You could lose your fortune and all your friends could abandon you. And that's definitely something the Stoics say that you would prefer not to happen. The wise man or woman prefers to have wealth and friends rather than having poverty and enemies. But what's ultimately more important is the way that he copes with it. And they say somebody could be flourishing, like Socrates. They would say, look at Socrates. Socrates was ridiculed and persecuted, threatened with exile, and ultimately forced to drink hemlock by the Athenians. Like people ganged up on him. And he lived in relative poverty. But they say, well, if we made Socrates more popular and gave him more money, would that have improved his life overall? Or, in a sense, wasn't Socrates such an amazing emblem of wisdom and resilience? Precisely because, he dealt well with lacking wealth and support from other people around him. Ironically, he was able to exhibit and exercise and cultivate virtue precisely because he was facing some adversity and he lacked these external advantages. The Stoics say we confuse external opportunities or advantages with intrinsic goods. So they would say there's a famous Platonic dialogue where Socrates, called the Euthydemus, where Socrates is asking a young man what good fortune consists in. And he says, well, that's easy, Socrates. It's like wealth, good looks, noble birth. We would say, having a nice car, a big house, all that kind of stuff. And Socrates says, let's begin with wealth, because that's actually the easiest one. Suppose you've got a big pile of money and you give it to somebody who's wise and virtuous. Seems like it would be a good thing, right? They could use that money to do lots of really cool things. They'd use it wisely and they benefit lots of people. But hang on a minute. What if you took that big pile of money and gave it to somebody who was foolish and vicious, like a genocidal maniac or an evil dictator or something like that? Wouldn't that just allow them to do more evil, and foolish things, basically? So isn't it really, the money is more like an external opportunity? It gives you actually more control over other people in your environment. But really what matters is the use that you make of it. You could use it wisely or you could use it foolishly. And Socrates says, spoiler alert, this applies to all of the other things that you listed as well. They're all external goods. They're really just advantages in life. The only thing that's intrinsically good is the wisdom and character that allows you to use all of these external advantages well. And so therefore, the only thing that could help you or harm you ultimately would be something that affected your inner character. This is the inner citadel, according to Stoicism. Like everything comes back to the most neglected thing in the universe, which is our own character and our own actions. We're constantly distracted by bells and whistles of life and external goals. We kind of forget about when we're on our deathbed and we're looking back, what ultimately matters is the type of person that we were, like our character and how we coped with things. Some people have good luck, some people have bad luck in life. What really matters is the way that they deal with the cards that they've been dealt by life. And so, yeah, I think this is important to type C people. I also have a question for type C people with type C personality traits. Are you ready? Are you sitting comfortably? I'm going to give you a Stoic question, right? The Stoics, given that they've got this radical philosophy, and I'm not saying that everybody always agrees with this, but I think this is what I like to call a humdinger of a question, right? So the Stoics, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, he's the most outspoken of the Stoics. He would say to a type C individual, what does you more harm? Letting other people down or your fear of letting other people down?
Yeah. I mean, we believe letting other people down is the most harmful, but we're trying to help people see that this is all driven by emotion. And if we can sit with difficult emotions and instead of running from them or suppressing them or doing the exact opposite to get relief from them, if we can simply experience them, not see them as such a bad thing,
Yeah,
and really, like you said, pause, consider the costs of what we're doing when we say yes instead of saying no and we overgive of ourselves, then we can make better, wiser decisions, more courageous decisions that are in our own benefit and helping us to achieve our own goals and hopefully creating new goals that are not around simply not letting other people down, living a more fulfilling life, doing the things that bring us joy, finding meaning and purpose in whatever we're doing.
And I would add to that by saying what you also said, which I think is so important, is recognizing that the fear actually doesn't live as strongly in the present moment. The
hmm
fear is from past experiences. And so
yeah,
the belief is tied to the emotion. And so we have this very, very strong belief that, and that emotion really drives us to do things. But
hmm
if we slow down and really think about this belief is not actually necessarily coming from this present moment, this belief is really coming from my past experiences.
yeah, and it refers to the future. There's a
Right,
lot of
future
strange
memory.
stuff going on with time perception. Also, when people are anxious and afraid, their perception of time often speeds up, you know. But our minds tend to be dragged into the future by anxiety in particular. What if this happens? What if that happens? How am I going to cope with it? And that distracts us from what's happening in the present moment, which is where we flourish. We don't flourish in the future, in the past. Like flourishing happens now from moment to moment. Like, if we are hoping that one day we're going to be happy, and one day we're going to flourish, well, I could get hit by a bus tomorrow. It might never happen, right? It has to happen. There's only one place it can happen. That's right now. It's got to, like, we have to at least begin the process right now, from moment to moment. The Stoics are very concerned with this idea that we should live each day as if it's our last, in a sense, in one sense. We have to plan for the future, but be grounded in the present. Like, because the big danger in life is that we forget about the present moment. We spend too much time preoccupied with the future or dwelling on and ruminating about the past. And then the future is always empty of value for us. We're always hoping that one day, we're going to succeed. We're going to get the praise that we deserve, get rewarded in the future. And then we get hit by a bus. We look back on it and think each of the present moments were empty of any value. Like I was always putting it off until one day I'll be happy. Like one day I'm gonna do something that I can be proud of. One day I'm gonna start to flourish. We need to start making the effort from moment to moment to live in a flourishing way, to live with integrity, to live with resilience. To take control of our lives. If you're living your life for other people, it's going to be difficult for you to do that. Um, and not only trying to please other people, there are many, many problems that it causes. Um, so, one of them often is that we're mind reading, right? We don't really even know whether what we're doing is important to other people or actually pleases them or not. Um, in a sense, we're kind of dominated by appearances and our feelings are driving our behavior. Epictetus is very blunt about these kind of things. He said, you imagine in the ancient world where slavery was a thing, Epictetus had been a slave and he was freed. And he says to the Roman nobleman that he's teaching, you would be ashamed to hand your body over to other people, like to voluntarily enslave yourself, I think is what he has in mind. In Roman society, that would be considered a profoundly shameful thing. He said you would be ashamed to hand your body over voluntarily to other people, and yet all of you constantly hand your minds over to other people by investing too much value in their opinion of you and trying to please them and gain their approval. You're enslaving yourselves. He says in doing that, you're enslaving yourself to other people.
Type C people.
Yeah, people pleasing is a form of voluntary enslavement, right?
I would say we hand our minds and our bodies over to other people, and
Yeah.
we live through them instead of living for ourselves. I just want to wrap up with one question, which I think will be so helpful for Type C. So the Stoics say that to live a meaningful life, we want to cultivate virtue, and specifically wisdom, moderation, justice, and courage. I think those are the four, but the one I
Yeah.
want to focus on is courage, because that's what we lack. We lack the courage to prioritize ourselves and really create lives for ourselves instead of creating lives for other people. So how would the Stoics say that we can cultivate courage?
Well, in part, there are many ways that they can do that. The core of it, in a sense, because they have a cognitive model of emotion, they think we have to realize the difference between things that genuinely harm us and that should therefore be genuinely avoided. It sounds simple in a way to say, courage is the ability to clearly grasp the distinction between things that should be genuinely avoided in life because they're actually harmful and things that only feel or appear harmful but aren't so in reality. For example, letting other people down might be something that feels catastrophic and appears catastrophic to us, but maybe in reality it isn't catastrophic. And so the Stoics think that courage consists in tearing down illusions and seeing through them. That's how they view it. And of course, this takes time to get there. We've got, first of all, to gain cognitive distance. We have to notice our frightened thoughts and have the ability to step back from them. We have to be able to tolerate feelings of discomfort and act courageously despite them. The Stoics think that we should also practice a form of imaginal exposure, as we call it in therapy, called premeditatio malorum, where we picture in advance things difficult situations. We imagine our worst fears, basically, as if they're happening right now, so that we can practice responding to them with wisdom and courage so that we're not taken by surprise. They think that they correctly, and I think this is a little bit neglected in cognitive therapy. The Stoics correctly, I think, diagnosed that shock, surprise, and disbelief amplify anger and anxiety. And yet, from an outside perspective, often they seem unwarranted. You know, some people often act like you go on holiday and somebody steals your wallet. You go, I can't believe this. What sort of person would do this? It's unbelievable. How could this possibly happen? Whereas someone else might think, dude, it happens every day. Like, there's pickpockets all over the place in tourist hotspots, right? It's like the one thing we can say for sure about it is it's not all that surprising, It kind of sucks when it happens to you, but the shock and the surprise probably gets in the way of coping constructively with it. Whereas if you thought, man, that sucks, but I guess these things happen in tourist hotspots, then it tends to lead to better coping, like more constructive problem solving. So the Stoics think partly by rehearsing things in advance, we should train ourselves to be more prepared for them and to not respond with shock or surprise towards setbacks, misfortunes in life. And shifting our perspective, questioning whether the things that people fear are really that intrinsically harmful as long as we cope wisely with them. Maybe what's more important is cultivating our own character. So changing our values, like placing more importance on individual flourishing. I mean, you could almost say for like the Stoics, as long as you shift your values so that the main thing is self-improvement and improving your character, then somebody disapproving of you or, going bankrupt or your partner abandoning you seem less catastrophic inherently, because the only really important thing is whether you cope with that wisely or foolishly and how you respond to it. Those are some of the things. I was going to say, I think, in a sense, temperance. Socrates knew a thing or two about virtue. He spent his life discussing it all day long. He was like Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix I'm reliably informed, never took his guitar off. He slept with it in his bed. He would fry eggs in the morning with his guitar strapped around him, right? That's what Socrates was like with the Socratic method. Like he did it all day long. He got up in the morning and went and did the Socratic method and questioned people about the nature of virtue in the gymnasia and the sports grounds. He did it in the agora where the shops are in the afternoon, and then in the evening he did it in the house of his friends all day long, every day. He was like somebody practicing guitar, like constantly. Um, and Socrates arrived at the conclusion that all the virtues were one, famously. He thinks you can't really separate them. They're all interrelated. So, for example, courage, what appears to be courage without wisdom and justice, is just recklessness. Courage has to be combined with wisdom and justice in order to genuinely be virtuous. Like all the virtues have to be combined. And so I would think with the type C, all the virtues are potentially relevant. But I think temperance is equally as relevant as courage. So temperance is realizing when we're doing something excessively and being aware if we're doing something maybe in a way that's inflexible or rigidly, and not being flexible and adaptive enough about it. Having self-awareness and moderation about the way that we pursue things. So a good example of that would be people pleasing. The Stoics, I think, would say that somebody who's rigidly and overly fixated on gaining the approval or love or affection of other people is lacking a particular type of temperance, because they're placing far too much value on something that's not directly under their control. And that's intemperate, and it's lacking in moderation. So the Stoics want to say we shouldn't be completely indifferent. I think something that confuses people is there's a sort of black and white thinking that happens, right? When we're under stress and we're emotional, we think in all or nothing terms. So we think, are you saying that I shouldn't care about other people at all? That I should be like a nihilist or something and just not give a damn about other people? Or sometimes people say, that's how I'm going to cope. I've had it. I've had it with other people. I've had it with men, I've had it with women, just had it with people in general, and you become a misogynist, a misandrist, a misanthrope, or just very cynical. Like, you do that for a while, and then that gets frustrating, and then you become overly attached to people again. So we tend to vacillate between that sort of avoidance that consists in not placing any value on other people, and then over attachment to other people's opinions. So it doesn't work out. And neither of these two things work out that well for us. And I think the via media, the middle ground, is to think, as Albert Ellis used to put it, that it's okay to care about approval and other people's opinions, as long as you don't do it too rigidly, right? But you do it, I guess, in a sense, with moderation. I think if you're an author, for example, you guys are working on a book, so you're going to very quickly, you're going to be confronted with every author's nemesis, which is the Amazon reviewer, right? And you're going to think, I hope people give my book nice reviews. But I think one of the advantages of being an author is you might get like hundreds of reviews of your book. And if you get enough, I guarantee you, so this is us, we'll do a little bit of premeditatio malorum together, right? I think it's fairly safe to say that there's going to be at least one reviewer that thinks that your book sucks. And it's the worst book they've ever read in their life, and you're just total jerks and idiots for having ever dared to write. There's going to be at least one person like that gives you 1-star review and thinks it's a terrible book. And there's going to be at least one person that thinks it's like the work of a genius, and that you're the new guru, and this is the most inspiring book of all books that they've ever read in their entire lifetime. And then the majority of people are going to be like somewhere in between. Like hopefully they're kind of skewed towards the positive, right? But one advantage of getting lots of feedback is potentially it makes you realize what would happen if you only fixated on the one person that gave you the 1-star review, and then you ignored all of the people that gave you like 4 and 5-star reviews, right? A rational way of looking at it would be to look at all of them, in a rounded and balanced way, and think, oh, as long as most people liked it, then maybe I'll write some more books. I might think about taking up a different job if everybody hated it. Like, but fortunately, that doesn't happen too often, right? If there's like one guy that thinks it's like the worst thing they've ever read, that doesn't matter too much, right? You might think I can deal with that. Like, it's just one dude's opinion, right? That's just your opinion. It doesn't really matter as long as other people liked it, right? But I think what happens is sometimes in life we commit what researchers call a sampling error, and we focus too much on the wrong person's opinion if we're not careful. And in life, it can be unfortunate because that sampling error, like that one person's opinion might be your mum or your dad, or it might be your boss at work, or it could be someone you end up in a relationship with, or you could be your best friend. And their opinions might not be representative of a broad sample. You have the mum and dad that you have. If, like on Amazon, you had hundreds of mums and hundreds of dads giving you your opinion, you might realize that you were unfortunate enough to get somebody that had an atypical opinion way of thinking about things. But I think so we become overly attached sometimes because of a sort of sampling error. We've almost put people on a pedestal in a sense and give them way too much authority. So chasing after other people's approval, I think, there's a kind of selective thinking involved in it. Anything that you do is going to be disapproved of by at least one person, probably by a bunch of people. You can't please all the people all the time. And so the only sane approach is to have a kind of flexible attitude that says, I'm okay with a certain amount of disapproval. I'll say something even more radical. The Stoics, once they kind of persuade people at this point, they usually go, there's a deeper secret, right? It goes even beyond this, which is in some ways, disapproval might be a good thing, right? So if you wrote a book that everybody liked and they gave 4 stars, 5 stars to, I'm going to say something shocking, right? Maybe the stuff that you're saying isn't all that original or challenging, right? Charles Darwin, when he wrote The Evolution of the Species, people hated it. He was mercilessly ridiculed for it. So many innovators and people, original thinkers throughout history, meet with criticism. Shakespeare got scathing reviews from his peers, right? So I put it to you that actually, if you're saying something challenging or you're saying something original, then you should expect that there's going to be a certain number of people who don't get it and disagree with it and don't like it. Yeah. If everybody likes everything you're saying, then it's possible that what you're saying is kind of banal and unoriginal. So
We
knowing
actually,
that,
I was going to say, we actually just had this thought the other day that, anything that we say that's a little bit controversial is not necessarily a bad thing because that's going to bring some attention to what we're
yeah,
saying. And I think that goes to your point of if we're saying what everybody else is saying, then what's different, what's unique, why are people going to read it?
what's the point if you're just telling people things that they already know? And, if what you say is controversial, it suggests that you're telling people something that they don't currently believe, that might be a revelation to them. You're doing them a favor by challenging. Imagine you go to therapy and your therapist just tells you stuff that you already know. Like, and they never like challenge you or they never say anything that kind of shocks or surprises you in any way. Like your therapist is just saying stuff and you're going, that's exactly what I always say. Like, I mean, that would be like just getting your ego stroked, right? At some point they're going to have to say something to you and there has to be like a WTF moment, and you think, what? Like, I don't know, and then it challenges you, and maybe even you get a little bit annoyed about it, like, but it maybe snaps you out of the trance of certain limiting beliefs or irrational beliefs that have become very familiar to you. So I do, don't be all the innovators get some pushback. You should be proud in a sense, but again, it's moderation, right? If everybody hates what you're doing, of course, that's not a good thing, right? The same as if you were a musician. With Jimi Hendrix, like some people thought it was just a racket, like if you're a musician and you're doing something and everybody thinks like, it's not bad, it's quite good. I mean, you're probably not challenging people and pushing the boundaries and came out with something really novel and original. But then again, when you're on your deathbed, you think, man, throughout my entire life, I succeeded in creating so-so art. Like, I'm really proud of that. Or would you look back and think, when I made my first record or wrote my first book, there were some people that hated it, right? But you'd probably look back and think, but I'm glad I did it, right? Because I feel like I said something that deserved to be said, and it was kind of original, and I stuck by my guns, you know. I didn't do it to please other people. I did it because I really believed in the truth of what I was saying. It was important to me to put that across. So that's courage, right? Is realizing that being afraid of getting one-star reviews on Amazon or being afraid of upsetting other people is an illusion because the disapproval doesn't really harm you. And in some ways, it might actually be a positive sign to some extent in moderation, as it were.
These are just really such great points. And I think, I'm hearing, obviously, there's a tremendous amount of overlap between cognitive behavioral therapy and Stoicism, cognitive flexibility. And I'm totally stealing your Amazon review idea to work with patients about, do you want to listen to the one negative review, or do you want to think about zooming out and having a more flexible stance? Well, I just want to say this has been such an interesting talk. There are so many other questions I would love to ask you, but we are kind of out of time. So maybe there'll be a take two, but I just want to say how thankful we are for having you on today. And people are hopefully going to listen to this podcast and think, okay, where can I find out more information? Obviously, they can go on Amazon and they can find your books. But where's the best place for people to find you and get more resources and information about you?
Well, the easiest place to find me now actually is on Substack. Like
Okay.
I put all my stuff on Substack nowadays, and then I've got the social media and all sorts of other things. But they can find out everything about me from my Substack account, which is just, it's my. If you search my name on Substack, you should be able to find it.
Wonderful. Well, we are so excited. I think if you're willing, we'd love to have you back at some point in the future. I just feel like we scratched the surface and there's so much more that we could really bring to our audience that would be so helpful. So please
Yeah,
consider
I
coming
agree.
back at some point.
I'd love to. I think it's fantastic. I really appreciate what you're doing. I've done lots of interviews, well over 100, right? Maybe close to 200 or something like that. And a lot of them are kind of similar, right? So the thing that I love is talking to people that have got a little bit more of a unique perspective. Like you're focusing on a particular concept, which is kind of a little bit been neglected, as you said, but undeservedly so. It's a very useful concept that a lot of people identify with. So it makes for a unique conversation, right? I think that's very interesting.
Well, we're
Wonderful.
so appreciative. Thank you so much. And we will be in touch soon to talk about more chatting. Do you want to stop recording or?